All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Neuroccino. The rules are like, as always, if you're interested in a paper and want to present it, just tell us and you'll be able to present it next week. But this week we have Patrick Friedrich. I don't know exactly how to pronounce your name. Friedrich?
Friedrich. It's fine. It's great.
Who is presenting a paper about language, hemisphere bias, and brain maturation, if I understand correctly. Is that right? Perfect.
That's correct.
So the floor is yours, and yeah, we're listening.
Can you share the paper just before the...
Oh yeah, I'm sorry for that. Certainly will. Just need to see. If I quickly get the DOI. So it's this one. You all have access to it now? Otherwise, we'll just do that.
Well, it's not creating an automatic link, so I'll check this directly. Or anyway, I link it. I link to it. So you can start if you want.
All right. So yeah, thanks for the introduction. Hopefully, I'm not yet a stranger to this fantastic group. Today, I wanted to show you a paper that caught my interest some weeks ago. It's called "A Weak Shadow of Early Life Language Processing Persists in the Right Hemisphere of the Mature Brain" by Martin et al. So, as we all know, language is one of the prime examples of a cognitive function that is typically attributed to the left hemisphere. This is especially true if we compare the two hemispheres of typical developing adults in terms of their activation, where we will find, depending on the language task, leftward activation in pars orbicularis, triangularis, so basically Broca's area, also in temporal region, including the planum temporale, almost always more strongly in the left hemisphere than the right hemisphere. So what they wrote is that we basically see that we begin life with a left hemispheric bias for language processing. However, we start out by showing a more bilateral activation pattern when we were younger, so basically as children. And here, the researchers wanted to investigate to what extent the spatial distribution, not the magnitude of activation, but the spatial distribution of language activation might persist in homotopic right hemispheric regions, which were equipotent for language processing in earlier years. They did this in children aged 4 to 13, as well as looked at it into young adults who performed an auditory sentence comprehension tasks. And I just want to skip a bit about over the introduction. Basically, they nicely explained their reasoning for the study. As I said before, in early years, we find basically also right hemispheric involvement in language processes. Ululade et al., for instance, have already shown that although the activation and magnitude is weaker in the right hemisphere, some form of significant clusters in the right hemisphere still persist. But the amount of participants showing right hemispheric significant activation for a given language task, in this case, it was also an auditory judgment task. The amount of participants that show significant clusters in the right hemisphere decrease with age. So they had 3 different age groups and could show that less and less participants showed right hemispheric activation that reached the significant threshold. However, the idea of this paper is to basically disregard significant thresholds, not completely, but look into the right hemisphere in a more liberal way. And I explain in a minute how they did that. And the question basically became whether or not homotopic regions in the right hemisphere that were equipotent for language still show some form of activity when we're using a different threshold approach. The approach that they used is the so-called top voxel approach. So basically, I'll explain in a minute how it looks precisely, but this approach has been used before by very well-known researchers such as F. Fedorenko et al. And they basically compared the 2 hemispheres by means of a dice coefficient. So as I said, the idea was to look into right hemispheric homotopic activation during a language task. And the hypothesis is that although the magnitude of activation might be decreased, the spatial pattern of activation might still stay intact in the right hemispheres, which would have some very nice implications with regards to, for instance, recovery of language functions, etc. And again, they looked into it in younger children as well as in young adults. So, as I said, this is just the distribution of the participants. So at 10, 14, 15, and 14 participants in age range from 4 to 6, 7 to 9, 10 to 13, and young adults that went from 18 to 28. They used an auditory description decision task. Basically, the participants were lying in the scanner and were hearing some auditory descriptions of an object or an animal. For instance, here, the big gray animal is an elephant, and they had to judge whether or not this sentence is correct. And this was then contrasted with the reversed sentence, basically. So a non-intelligible auditory stimuli. They had the pleasure to do this study in 3 Tesla and did some, well, very basic sequence, basically, with a resolution of 3 by 3 by 3 voxels. And here you can find the pre-processing afterwards. So let me just make this a bit bigger. You have the t-statistic maps, which are forward, so normal condition, where participants heard the sentence correctly and then had to judge whether or not the sentence makes sense, versus the reverse speech. They have the left and right hemisphere. And in order to compare the two, they flipped the right hemisphere to fit onto the left hemisphere after symmetrical spatial alignment, obviously. They searched for some regions of interest, and their approach was also quite clever, I think, because they used the Neurocino meta-analysis or Neurocino database, searched for studies that had language as keyword, and basically decided to pick a frontal and temporal, artificial region of interest from that. And then they came to this top voxel level threshold approach, where they basically looked into different threshold counts of different p-values. And if they were too inadequate to one another, they chose to report the more or less strict, less lenient threshold for both hemispheres. So this basically counteracts to I think a large degree the effect of the inherent difference in magnitude in activation, because this will undoubtedly be in favor of the left hemisphere. So, and after for each participant choosing more or less adequate threshold in terms of the p-value, they basically just used a dice coefficient over the pattern of leftward and rightward activated voxels to see to what degree the two hemispheres or their activation pattern resemble one another. So coming to the results already. Oh yeah, one thing that is also nice is basically they used penetrance maps to later show the localization of similarity between participants. Anyways, what they found now is, first of all, when comparing the dice coefficients and this similarity here on the y-axis for the frontal ROI and for the temporal ROI across the 4 age groups, they could find here that all dice coefficients were hugely above this artificial line. So these white dots represent, or this dashed line represents the dice coefficients that would be measured between random arrangements of same number of voxels in the left and right hemisphere. And we can find that the dice coefficient indeed, regardless of the group, regardless of the ROI, exceeds this threshold, meaning it appears to be more similar, the activation pattern in left and right hemisphere compared to a random arrangement. Interestingly, they did not find a significant effect of age, which is also quite visible here already. But this means that or can be interpreted as such that the right hemisphere or the regions related to language in the right hemispheres still stay the same and keep their inherent property of being somewhat sensible for language. And this later on becomes important in the discussion. Just wondering if I can show you anything else that would be of interest, but I think that was basically the most important thing here. Combination with this table, with this two-way mixed Anova, where they basically also showed that this has something to do with individual differences, because they found a main effect of overlap comparison within participant for both the frontal and temporal regions. So the patterning basically is reliant on pairwise individual comparisons. But again, there is no effect of the age group, and there's also no interaction effect of this individual overlap between the two hemispheres and the age. So I thought this was quite interesting to see, especially given that they here also visualized the penetrance map, which then shows homotopic activations that are consistent for each age group. So you can see here that color-coded is the percentage of participants with homotopic activation during the language processing. These are homotopic maps showing overlap between left and right hemisphere. And we can see that indeed the pattern appears to be the same, regardless of the age group. Obviously, here in some areas, in adults, there seem to be slight differences in how many participants still share the same pattern here. But regardless of that, the general look of the pattern stays the same. So what do we make out of this? One thing that I found quite interesting was that this has, as they argued, potential implications for recovery of aphasia. Because basically, if even in the adult brain, the areas that are related to language in the right hemisphere still possess some form of functioning, or let's say skill in processing language, then it might imply that recovery of language functions could be increased or made easier for participants when using this information about this right hemispheric effect. And indeed, they showed that, for instance, in recovery for language after stroke, participants are sometimes encouraged to gesticulate with the left hand to basically raise activation of the right hemisphere. They also see this in therapies, basically, which is then called an intention therapy, where you perform complex movements during the naming of a picture. And this might obviously then also even increase this effect by means of simultaneous brain stimulations. Having said that, like, I think it's a very, very nice study, but obviously it also comes with some limitations. For instance, the chosen approach for finding homotopic regions or regions of interest was very loose, to say the least, because obviously if you look here into the frontal ROI and this temporal ROI, it basically includes all of the superior temporal gyrus and parts of the medial temporal gyrus, and this basically includes the entire inferior frontal lobe, to some degree supplementary motor areas. So yes, we know a lot of areas are related to language. Obviously, this is meta-analysis driven using Neuroccino, but you can obviously go a bit more strict with regards to functional homology between left and right areas, such as, for instance, using the Aisha Atlas, or as they say, looking into Euclidean distance from left hemispheric and right hemispheric activation centers to find the homologous pairs. Also, obviously, the group sizes were quite small, so this always has to be taken with a grain of salt. And the actual interpretation is, as they wrote, somewhat constrained by the contrast that they used for the two task conditions that they created. But overall, I think this was a very, very interesting study, at least for me. And it really shows something that we actually should be aware of, that even though we think that the left hemisphere, or certainly know the left hemisphere is dominant for language, or that one hemisphere is dominant for any process, really, being it visuospatial attention for the right hemisphere, that does not mean that the other hemisphere has no competence anymore in such tasks. And I think this is quite good to know. Okay, I think I stop here so that we've got some time for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Patrick, for this incredible presentation. And so if you have questions, don't hesitate.
Yeah, Chris, I think you were first.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. As you mentioned in the limitations, so first they have a small data set, but also do you think that if I understood correctly, they look at the effect in the regions that you showed in red and yellow. Do you think they would find because if you increase the size of your selected regions, because they say they look at a weak effect, so I'm worried that you could find a weak effect if you in other regions, if you selected other regions. Do they account for that possibility? Do they check if they would find the same weak effect outside of the selected regions?
No,
it's not an artifact.
I think that's a really interesting point. You're right. It would have been probably even more like the argumentation would maybe be even stronger if they would have done that, to really show that there is no activation pattern outside of this, or no overlap in activation pattern outside of this, of the chosen regions, because obviously it was a language task and the chosen regions were based on language, on the language keyword in
Neuroccino. It would have
Neuroccino.
shown that it's really specific to these regions.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, good point.
Maybe maybe someone can do that in a new study.
Yeah. Thanks. Good point. Hervé?
Yes, thanks, Pat. Very clear presentation, as usual. Now, my question was, so they looked at age, and I'm surprised they dichotomized their groups. So why they didn't use a continuous variable? Because in this way, it's more difficult. In a way, you cut your groups. It's sometimes more difficult to see an age effect. So I don't know why they didn't look at a kind of linear age continuous variable.
Yeah, I think that would be quite interesting as well, like using basically correlating age with the amount of dice index. Yeah,
yeah,
I
because
think that would be interesting.
Yeah, because they have three groups of young and they put an adult. So they put this, so the weight of each of these groups are the same, but in fact, if you look at the regression, it would not be the same. But
probably, but in their defense, they use the same age groups as have been published before in a similar study that they were inspired by. Okay. So I think that was part of the logic behind that, to make the comparison. Yeah, but you're right. Still, that would have been interesting to see. Yeah. So now I don't know who was first. If it was Mar or if it was Sarah. So please, just one of the two of you.
Hello.
Hi.
This is not my topic, but I had like two questions. One of them is like if the authors, they control for laterality of the participants?
No, I think they did not. So I have not, or I just quickly check if they did some form of, if they just assumed leftward dominance for language, or if they had some form of.
But I mean like hand laterality.
Oh, yeah. Oh. Yeah, well, we know, obviously, handedness appears to always have an impact on many things. But to be fair, language lateralization is not one of those things. Like if you compare the groups of left-handers and right-handers, I'm not sure if that was in summer 28 or Summers is the author. or if the numbers come from someone else, but numbers in the literature always say that right-handers show leftward dominance in language in about 95% of cases, and left-handers still show, I think, 75% or even higher than that. But please don't really quote me then on
when
that.
I remember from when I studied my degree that we were studying something like that, like the right-hander, they have more right lateralizing at 19-something%, but the left, it was, if I remember well, like 50-50 or something like that. But maybe this is super old because I'm not in this topic anymore.
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's definitely higher than that. So even left-handers show the abundant majority of left-handers show leftward dominance in language, rightward dominance in visuospatial attention, etc., etc. Yeah.
My second question, maybe it's also silly, but I was thinking if they choose a group of children that haven't learned to speak yet, do you think you will find?
No. So the earliest children that they looked into were 4 years old.
So they will be able to speak.
Yeah.
So, but if you think they will find something different with younger children before being able to speak?
Well, that would be really interesting. I think maybe, but that's just like kind of an educated guess. I would assume that they would find then even stronger similarity between the hemispheres. So we know, for instance, that prior to reading acquisition, which also starts like at 4, typically children show bilateral, that goes in another direction, sorry. I was a little bit lost in thought. So, but still, like, I think they would show more bilateral activation. I wanted to hint at something else. Sorry.
Okay, thanks.
Hello.
Hi.
Do you hear me? Okay.
Yeah.
So I have more technical questions, but because I'm not really into fMRI, I'm starting with that. So how the top voxel approach, I didn't get it exactly what they do, because I used Aisha, so I really more secure about the comparison between areas, but here.
So the top voxel approach had nothing to do with the choice of regions, right? So that was not the core thing. But the issue is that basically, if I understood it correctly, is that obviously we have magnitude differences in the left and right hemisphere. So which threshold is fair to even include the right hemisphere in? Because if you go with a threshold that's too high, you won't see any right hemispheric activation, right? Which also is part of their argument why this effect has not been focused so much, that the right hemisphere might still be included in language. So basically, if I understood it correctly, they chose these 4 different threshold cutoffs, which is basically p-value of 0.01, 0.005, 0.001, and even one less than that. And they then looked into the participants themselves, and if they had fewer voxels with a given t-value, then the standard average of their entire group, then they chose to go 1 threshold deeper. So basically, they went from 0.01 to the next threshold level. Because you could obviously have dependent on the acquisition, depend on the participant, and dependent on the participant's language laterality. So if this participant would be strongly left lateralized, it might affect like if you can see anything on the right hemisphere anymore. Mm-hmm. And given that it was not the magnitude that they wanted to compare, but the number of voxels basically, and the spatial alignment of the voxels, they chose this approach.
Okay, and maybe you already answered me, but I'm not sure about the T-map, how they get it. Like it's like the T-map of all of them? Or?
Yeah, the T-map was basically a contrast map between this forward spoken, correctly answered conditions where they heard a sentence and needed to judge whether or not the sentence made sense. And they reversed the sentence. So basically they played it back in reverse, which then is unintelligible. And participants had to listen to that, and they contrasted these two contrasts.
And then they do the team. How they manage to have like the? I mean, is my question, or they don't have this.
Well, what do you mean with the mean? You mean the average of the participants? Yeah. Then basically, after you've got this for each participant. You've got your T contrast, you can have your group average, right?
Okay.
And yeah, and you can have the group average as different threshold points, then extract the number of voxels and see whether or not an individual participant would fall in this.
And also, maybe silly question, but why they don't compare between resting state from the task?
Yeah, it's typically in, like, I'm not a linguist either, right? So, but if I understood correctly, you want to try to compare or to create language contrasts always in the sense that you still have similar tasks. So basically, if you don't have any auditory input here, but you would compare it to rest, then who is to say that the effect that you're showing is really language dependent or depends on linguistic content, where it could just be affected by having auditory stimulation or not. So I believe this is the reasoning behind it.
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome. Okay,
so
I think
yes,
that concludes it.
Okay, so we are done. Replacing Victor and Steph. Thank you very much for today's Neuroccino. We see you next week, and have a nice science week.
Well, next week.
Next week.
Short disclaimer: next week is OHBM, so I'm not sure who is here.
Maybe in 2 weeks.
No one.
Are you going, Pat?
Yes, I'm at OHBM.
So we'll meet there.
Yeah, let's do that.
Who else is going? Nobody else? 2 of us. Okay.
Yeah. So we are saying goodbye to you two people, and
yeah, we will think of you when we have some whiskey.
Yes.
Over in Scotland.
And beer.
So